The resurrection of Jesus Christ is the cornerstone of the Christian faith. If Jesus did not actually rise from the dead, as the Gospels claim, then the entire foundation of Christianity crumbles. The resurrection is the essential event that validates Jesus' divinity, confirms the efficacy of his death on the cross, and promises eternal life for all who believe in him. Yet, the resurrection account has been the subject of intense scrutiny and debate over the centuries. Some argue that the resurrection story is simply a myth or legend fabricated by the early followers of Jesus. Others claim the accounts are historically unreliable or contradictory. And still, others insist the resurrection can be explained through natural, non-supernatural means. By the end, you should have a better understanding of what the Bible actually says about the resurrection of Jesus and whether it can withstand the tests of historical inquiry. This is a crucial issue that strikes at the heart of the Christian faith, so let's approach it thoughtfully and with an open mind. The Last Supper and Crucifixion, 500 words. To properly understand the resurrection accounts, we must first review the events leading up to Jesus' death. The Gospels all describe Jesus sharing a final Passover meal with his disciples, known as the Last Supper. This took place in Jerusalem just before the Jewish feast of Passover. During this meal, Jesus told his disciples that one of them would betray him, and he identified Judas Iscariot as the betrayer. Jesus then instituted the sacrament of communion, asking his followers to remember him by partaking of bread and wine that represented his body and blood. After the meal, Jesus went with his disciples to the Garden of Gethsemane, where he agonized in prayer over the suffering he was about to endure. There, Judas arrived with a group of soldiers and temple guards and betrayed Jesus with a kiss, leading to his arrest. Jesus was then put on trial before the Jewish Sanhedrin Council, who condemned him to death for blasphemy. He was handed over to the Roman authorities, specifically Pontius Pilate, the regional governor. Pilate ultimately sentenced Jesus to be crucified, even though he found no legitimate basis for the death penalty. The Gospels provide detailed accounts of Jesus' cruel crucifixion, including the mocking, flogging, and nailing of his body to a wooden cross. After hours of agony, Jesus cried out, "It is finished," and breathed his last breath. His lifeless body was then taken down from the cross and placed in a tomb belonging to a wealthy follower named Joseph of Arimathea. The tomb was sealed with a large stone, and Roman guards were posted to secure the site and prevent anyone from tampering with the body. This was meant to ensure that Jesus remained dead and buried. On the first day of the week following the crucifixion, the Gospel accounts describe a remarkable discovery: the tomb where Jesus had been laid was empty. The first to make this discovery were a group of women, including Mary Magdalene, who had come to the tomb early in the morning to anoint Jesus' body with burial spices. When they arrived, they found the large stone covering the entrance had been rolled away. Peering inside, they saw that the tomb was vacant. Jesus' body was nowhere to be found. Understandably, the women were greatly perplexed and alarmed by this unexpected sight. The Gospels then describe a series of encounters the women had with angelic figures who told them that Jesus had risen from the dead, just as he had foretold. The angels instructed the women to go and inform the male disciples of this astounding news. Upon hearing the women's report, the disciples, including Peter and John, immediately rushed to the tomb to investigate. They, too, found the tomb empty, with only the linen burial cloths remaining. John, in particular, is said to have believed the women's testimony after seeing the empty tomb for himself. The Gospels make it clear that the empty tomb was the first indication that something extraordinary had occurred. The body of Jesus, which had been securely sealed in the tomb, was no longer present. This raised an obvious question: what had happened to the body? However, these theories struggle to account for all the details in the biblical accounts. The Gospel writers seem confident that the tomb was truly empty, and they connect this to Jesus' resurrection from the dead. The most substantial evidence for the resurrection of Jesus, according to the Gospels, comes from the numerous post-resurrection appearances of Jesus to his followers. These encounters are described in all four Gospels as well as the book of Acts. The Gospels report that on the day of the resurrection, the risen Jesus first appeared to Mary Magdalene, who had been weeping at the tomb. She initially mistook him for the gardener until he called her by name, and she then recognized him as the resurrected Christ. Later that same day, 2 of Jesus' disciples were walking to the village of Emmaus when the risen Jesus approached them and began walking alongside them. Though they did not recognize him at first, their eyes were opened, and they realized it was Jesus when he broke bread with them. That evening, the Gospel of John records that Jesus appeared to a group of his disciples who were gathered in a locked room. He greeted them with the words, "Peace be with you," and showed them his wounded hands and side, proving he was indeed the crucified one who had risen from the dead. The Gospels go on to describe several other post-resurrection appearances of Jesus over the next 40 days. He was seen by the 12 disciples, by 500 of his followers at one time, and by his brother James. The book of Acts also records his final appearance to the 11 before his ascension into heaven. These appearances were not mere visions or hallucinations, the Gospels insist. Jesus interacted with his followers, spoke with them, ate with them, and allowed them to touch him. In one instance, he even invited the skeptical disciple Thomas to physically inspect the wounds in his hands and side. The Gospel writers present these encounters as solid historical facts, not pious legends or mythological symbolism. They emphasize the tangible, physical nature of Jesus' resurrection, in contrast to a purely spiritual resuscitation. The risen Jesus was no mere ghost, but a flesh and blood individual who had conquered death. Some skeptics have argued that the disciples were simply hallucinating or experiencing subjective visions. However, this explanation fails to account for the sheer number and variety of appearances reported in the Gospels. Hallucinations are typically individual experiences, not group phenomena witnessed by hundreds of people over an extended period. Furthermore, the disciples' initial reactions of fear, doubt, and disbelief cast doubt on the notion that they were predisposed to imagining the risen Jesus. Their transformation from cowering fugitives to bold proclaimers of the resurrection also suggests a dramatic, objective, and life-changing event, rather than mere wishful thinking. The Gospels present the post-resurrection appearances as the climactic proof that Jesus had indeed conquered death and risen from the grave. This extraordinary event validated his divine identity and authority, just as he had predicted. It was the ultimate vindication of his life, teachings, and sacrificial death on the cross. In addition to the resurrection accounts in the Gospels, we also have crucial testimony from the Apostle Paul, a former persecutor of the early church who dramatically converted to Christianity. In his first letter to the Corinthian church, Paul provides a list of people to whom the risen Jesus appeared. This includes the 12 disciples, 500 brethren at once, James, and Paul himself. Significantly, Paul claims that this was the established tradition that he had received from others, indicating this was not merely his own subjective vision. Paul's testimony is particularly important because he was not one of the original 12 disciples. In fact, he was an adversary of the church who had persecuted and imprisoned followers of Jesus. Yet, his life was radically transformed when he encountered the risen Christ on the road to Damascus. According to the book of Acts, Paul was traveling to Damascus to round up Christians when a blinding light from heaven stopped him in his tracks. He heard the voice of Jesus asking, "Saul, Saul, why do you persecute me?" This supernatural encounter led to Paul's dramatic conversion, and he immediately began preaching that Jesus was the true Messiah. What is remarkable about Paul's testimony is that he presents the resurrection appearances as historical facts that could be verified by multiple eyewitnesses, including hostile witnesses like himself. He does not appeal to personal revelation or subjective visions, but to the established tradition and testimony of those who had seen the risen Lord. Furthermore, Paul's conversion and subsequent suffering for the sake of the gospel message lend strong credibility to his witness. He was willing to endure beatings, imprisonment, and eventual martyrdom for his faith in the resurrected Christ. This hardly fits the profile of someone propagating a known falsehood. By including Paul's testimony, the biblical accounts present a multifaceted case for the resurrection that goes beyond the Gospels alone. The conversion of this former enemy of the church, who then became one of its most influential leaders, serves as powerful corroborating evidence. The biblical writers present the resurrection of Jesus as the pivotal event that validates his divine identity and mission. If Jesus did not actually rise from the dead, then his claims to be the Son of God and the Messiah would be false, and his sacrificial death on the cross would be meaningless.